another massive U-turn. What's going on?
It's a U-turn because not just the numbers, but the breadth of concern being expressed by Labour backbenchers about the bill to reform personal independent payments and other areas within welfare has really gone down very badly. And therefore, you know, Starmer has had to respond. And it is interesting because nearly everybody I've heard talking about this, all the people who signed the letter, it was organised and led by Dame Meg Hillier, all say that they recognise reform is needed, but they are concerned about some of the measures in this bill that means that some people will have their benefits changed and worries about the lack of support and funding there to support people into work. Now, I think Liz Kendall and her team actually have a lot of positive things to say in this bill about support for people who are out of work, support for people who have ill health and disabilities. The problem has been, Rob, is that a few months ago, just before the spring statement, there was a briefing out, I think, from the Treasury to say this will save £5 billion. And then instead of seeing it as reform, it was seen through the optics of cutting funding. And somewhere along the way, and there is indications that Number 10 were warned about this increasing amount of concern. They have been, you know, immune to this. And that's why, after a very hectic fortnight, which he must be exhausted, I have to say, in terms of all the things he's been having to do overseas, he's had to come back and try and salvage the situation.
I mean, you say it's been seen through the optics of the £5 billion reform, but what £5 billion cut, but what else would it be, really? I mean, I think the reason why it's played like this is because, yes, you're right, I think a lot of the people that were supporting you know, or didn't want to support it would actually be in favour of reform. Nobody thinks the benefit system's perfect.
Yeah.
However, the way it felt, and there will be a lot of people genuinely in their core feeling so relieved this morning that they might be saved, if you like, from having those benefits removed. Because you're talking about taking benefits from people that can't wash themselves, you know, can't do the basics of life. And that is never going to feel good, because it doesn't feel like a Labour government would do that unless it was actually about money.
They would argue that that is not the case in the bill, but what they are looking at is that since 2019, the number of people coming onto benefits to support, you know, health and disabilities has rocketed. A lot of that is associated with very younger people, with mental health, anxiety and other illnesses. But also the bill has gone up by something like 20 billion since 2019 and is expected to double by the end of the decade.
But that's what I mean, because, yes, that's an impossible, it's a terrible economic situation. There isn't, you know, there isn't a money tree, as was famously said. So it has become about money, hasn't it?
Well, that's where it's been a problem, I think, for Liz Kendall and her team, because I think they sincerely wanted to have a discussion about reform and what is necessary. And this is certainly not, I don't think, from Liz Kendall, is for those people who really, really need support with washing, feeding and clothing themselves, was anything in her sights that was the group of people they were going for. But there were some issues around, if you like, the sort of more minor end in terms of illness and support that's needed to have a look at it and how that's worked. But importantly, we have seen over the last 10 years or so support for people with ill health to get back into work being reduced.
And that was why it was so confusing to people.
Yeah, exactly.
Because things like PIP are often the very thing that allows people with disabilities and health issues to continue working.
And it's not working. That's not working.
You know, Salma, just to be clear, it's not a complete U-turn. It's a concession in order to stop Keir having a disaster in Parliament. It appears that all they're doing is saying, look, if you're going to claim PIP as a new payment, this won't apply to you. So we've got that, but also the fact that, I mean, this just seems to many people like amateur hour. Apart from anything else, if you're going to amend the benefit system, the people you should be consulting are the people most effective, disability groups. They didn't seem to do that at all. Does that surprise you?
No, it doesn't. And I think this is a real terrible feature of all governments. And I think, you know, Conservative governments are guilty of this as well, is that consultation processes seem just like a rubber stamp for something that you've done already, that you've decided already. And it's not really about engaging with the groups of people that you're trying to help or affect. It's just that the Treasury says it needs to save X amount of money, so it's going to save X amount of money.
There was basic incompetence. I mean, what the disability groups been saying to me, there was basic incompetence, like, you know, giving 24 hours notice for a consultation group that covered the whole region. At one point, it was all of Wales, which people with disabilities couldn't get to with that amount of notice. And I think the one in Wales was then cancelled. You know, so things that just made people feel like not only are you not engaging with us, but you don't understand what our normal daily life is about.
Yeah.
You know, and that feels like governmental incompetence.
But can I also say, legislative consultations require a minimum of 12 weeks sort of time frame in order to complete them. So nobody should be in a position where they are being rushed to contribute to a consultation.
But they were, nevertheless, and this gets announced, in circumstances where you have people who are the most affected absolutely terrified. Can I go back to something that you said, which is just the bill here. The Times reporting that we are spending more on welfare than we are on defence. That's obviously topical at the moment. But on top of that, the largest increase, 16%, are young people experiencing anxiety and depression.
Yeah. And undoubtedly, there are a larger number of young people. We know this through when we talk about social media, we talk about the impacts from the pandemic. But actually, for a lot of those young people, and this is where I think, you know, the government is absolutely right and Liz Kendall is right, is we should be engaging with them early on to make sure they're getting the right support, whether that's talking therapies, whether it's other support, to enable them to deal with their anxiety and support them through that and keep them in work. It's just not sustainable.
But that costs money as well.
And that costs money.
This is the problem,
and this is,
isn't it? Yeah, this is the difficulty. And so you're sort of saying we've got an overstretched, we've got an overstretched mental health system and we're taking away the money. And the thing that worries about me is the stats are extraordinary about the percentage of young people that are increasingly affected, which means that even though those who will be so relieved beyond measure that their benefits are protected, the new people coming along, the younger people in the future, will not be. So we've got an increasing problem.
Well, one thing they have apparently got out of these 5 to midnight discussions before the vote next week is, and this is another issue which will raise problems for the Chancellor, is bringing forward the support package, because this was the other sticking point in this, is based on the original bill expectations, the restrictions would come into place, but the actual money for the support wouldn't kick in until nearly the end of this decade. Now, a lot of organisations were saying, well, OK, if we accept the argument for changes to the way the benefits are allocated, to then say this is about helping people back into work and not having the means to do that can't be right. And so apparently one of the concessions is they're going to bring forward £1 billion to support people earlier, but that will create another issue
and
for
the other problem
the
is
finances.
That there will be relief for those that they're protected. However, the cost of this U-turn, they're estimating, is £3 billion. So that £5 billion of savings that was promised, even if it was very deeply painful and unworkable for those that were getting the benefits removed, is actually only going to save £2 billion, potentially. So the whole thing politically feels like such a mess-up.
But it's not just that. The politics of it and, you know, the backbench rebellion and the fact that Keir Starmer seems to have lost control of the Parliamentary Labour Party actually pales in comparison to the economic impact. This is not just about government finances. This is actually about how you're going to fill that shortfall. So when the Chancellor comes back to a budget event in the autumn, it is highly unlikely that she's not going to have to put taxes up.
About 1.5 billion is being suggested because of this climb down. It is going to be in that shortfall, which will have to be made up somewhere in taxation. Now, one of the things that people don't really understand here is, of course, this is, you might argue, politically problematic, some would say catastrophic for the Labour Party. But you know, what's really going on here? Why are there so many rebels, including young ones? Are they worried about the fact that in many of their constituencies, after we had the poll yesterday, Reform are doing well there? What's really going on? And also, what's the position of the Conservative Party? Kemi Badenoch seems to be sitting back, rubbing her hands, but not saying very much.
I think Kemi and the Conservatives, like you say, have been extraordinarily focused on reform. And you'll see that the stories that they've put out in today's press really revolve around migration and the deal with France that that the government has just announced on a one-in, one-out basis for people arriving on boats. So I think they have been squarely focused on cultural issues. Do I think that's an error? Yes, probably, because this isn't really about what government can deliver, and it's more about sort of the way people are feeling rather than what's going to be impacted. But I think Caroline and I both have to accept that this idea of the mainstream parties and us being a two-party system in Britain is very much over, and we have to adapt to that.
Look, I think the local elections, Labour lost 2/3 of its councillors in those local elections. There was
we have an 18-year-old running one council, I think, at the moment, right?
Yeah, right. A reform councillor has had to step in because
temporarily suddenly found himself in control of a £500,000 budget, and overnight.
He's determined to stay. He said
£500 million.
But I mean, the latest polls showing that if there was a general election tomorrow, I mean, all these things are, you know, it's not the same as having a real election, but they're saying that Reform would get 271 seats. And therefore they would be the largest party in terms of seats. That is very worrying, obviously, for Labour, but also for the Conservatives too. And then I think post the local elections, there was the U-turn on the winter fuel payment. And again, there are echoes of what's happened with the disabilities legislation, with the decision around the winter fuel payment last year, because again, it was seen as a way to plug a gap in the finances, and then recently said, well, actually, we don't need to do that now, we can do this. And
I think like two unpopular things they've had to row back on after a landslide win. It doesn't bode well, does it?
Well, they've got to get their act together, really. And I think part of it is about, you know, number 10 being, you know, what's happened here? Were they warned about the increasing concerns on the backbenches? Did they ignore that? Is there a bit of optimism bias there that they think because we've got a large majority and we had a fantastic landslide last year, we don't have to worry? The truth is, big majorities bring their own problems. Over a majority of the intake, I understand, from 24 are new MPs. In 1997, new MPs were a minority of Labour MPs, even though we had a landslide majority. So managing this, and of course there are, if you like, Meg, forgive me, veteran MPs in there who've led on this rebellion. But there's also a lot of new MPs who are really worried about their seats, and they're looking what's happening in Reform. They're listening to what their constituents are telling them. And again, this has been expressed in this 120 people who signed the letter to get them to change.
Salma, you were talking about immigration and what Kemi Badenoch has been focusing on. Just to be clear, small boat crossings reach record levels with more than 18,000 migrants reaching the UK so far this year. That's up 43%. That obviously exercises people. Now, there's talk of this one-in, one-out deal where we'll accept people if they've got families in this country in return for returning people who came here illegally. What do you think of this policy? How far is it actually going to get? I can't imagine it being sold very well to a number of the people who are rebelling in the Labour Party.
Yeah, indeed. And I think if you're, like Caroline says, if you're worried about Reform candidates breathing down your neck in Labour seats with partial majorities, a deal like this, how would you sell it on the doorstep? How do you explain to people that people are arriving illegally, but what we're going to do is we're going to have a returns policy because France has got its own issues and Emmanuel Macron is also facing the same kind of forces that we are here, that he can't just take everybody back and absorb that into the French population. He needs to feel or show that he's got some kind of win, and therefore he'll take some people back, but he won't take everybody back. It feels like an unfair thing. So explaining that, if that indeed is what the Prime Minister's going to agree to, I think is going to be a hard sell.
I mean, this is big. This is one of the things you mentioned he will be exhausted for, isn't it? Because he's been at NATO and he's been talking to France, to Keir Starmer, about this thing. Is it potentially a good deal? Because it's always been the case that we need to get France engaged, don't we, and to deal with that.
Yeah, I mean, France is key to the situation about the boat crossings, but it's tricky and complicated. I mean, one of the arguments that the UK government has to face from other colleagues in France and other countries is, well, we're an island. Are you saying that if anyone arrives illegally, they cannot apply for asylum? Now, a returns policy could be, and we've done it with, for example, with Ukrainians, we've done it with people from Hong Kong as well, who've come to this country through routes that have been organised. They've been organised out of country to come in. If this means actually we can accept people who are legitimate asylum seekers and play our role internationally to support that, I think that's a good thing. The problem is, as Salma quite rightly says, what the people see is people on boats with organised criminal gangs coming in illegally. The idea that there should be a swap around that is quite a hard sell. But the truth is, I know we've been talking about the benefits and obviously the winter fuel allowance recently. For those Labour voters who have gone to reform, tackling illegal immigration is their number one issue.
This is the thing I don't understand. Do Kerry, I don't really understand this because, you know, people at home will be worried about the boats. That's what, you know, why reform has got such momentum at the moment, because it's unfair. And the word asylum seeker, exactly as you're describing, Caroline, means people are legally applying to come here because they are at risk of their lives. And there's an immigration system and a legal system that guarantees those rights, and most British people support that. And should. Including, in many respects, reform voters who say the same thing. But what I understand here is this isn't really about asylum seekers. It's about people coming here on boats looking for work. Those are economic migrants, aren't they?
Exactly. And that's where this whole thing falls down. We can all keep the principle of, you know, wanting to support refugees and asylum seekers. But if you look at the returns numbers, last year, a high percentage of those coming over were from Albania. And so we've had to have lots of returns back there because it was people seeking work. Now, the Conservatives would argue that this is the reason why you should have some sort of Rwanda scheme that obviously did not go well under the Conservative administration. But I understand that the Labour government is now looking at what we call third country processing, which is you are processed, you go through a route to see if you are eligible, but it doesn't happen in this country to act as a deterrent. Now, some might argue that that is something that they need to look at much more closely and work out whether third country processing is something that they might do, or a version of Rwanda.
I think what we're also hearing from Labour now more loudly is concerns about the ways in which, through the courts, through various, obviously, European Convention on Human Rights, the Secretary of State, Ministry of Justice, has said there needs to be some talk about reform, because we know of these cases, and they may not represent the whole, but when you hear of cases where, people have come here, they've been given, protection to stay here and right to remain, and then they commit the most terrible crimes. Yep. We seek to deport them, and this has happened. It's happening under Labour. It's happened under the Tories as well, and then for the most ridiculous reasons, it would seem to anyone with any common sense, are being allowed to stay here and not deport them. I mean, these are other aspects.
You think the Labour Party should make a clear statement and withdraw from the European Convention?
No, I don't think they should withdraw, but I think what we're hearing more loudly, Rob, from Shabana Mahmood and others, is there's an issue here about what...
But an issue that doesn't really sort of help.
Well, she is saying there should be reform, but also with some of the those judges and others who are operating in the immigration courts, a conversation here about how do you apply a balance of rights to the balance of rights for an individual to be their family against actually the balance of rights of safety for people in this country. And she's trying to stimulate a discussion with those people about what is the balance and has it gone too far protecting the rights of an individual who has committed crimes, who has done some terrible things, but is apparently being said, you can stay here because you're a dad.
Well, judges are just following the law. In this case, you're talking about things like if you've got a family here, that is offset against the risk of going back to the country of origin. All they do is follow what the politicians say.
Well, they make a judgment. They make a judgment about what weighting they give to these things.
Not the fault of the judges.
We've got a politicians and legal row kicking off here.
Having lived through Brexit, I can do without a politician versus legal argument.
Should we talk assisted
Give me 5 lawyers, I'll give you 5 different opinions.
Like economists. They're like economists.
Shall we talk assisted dying, talking of passages of bill and politicians and law? A vote for the passage of the bill last week, and the White House, rather unusually, has commented on British politics and bills in a very specific way, issuing a formal statement saying Britain is basically state-sponsored suicide, is their view of the passage of this bill and the vote for it. Is that what's that about? Is that just about them shoring up the right wing of their party? And how should we view it?
Well, first of all, it's none of their business in the way that we pass legislation here, and it shouldn't be an official statement. Every individual is allowed to have their opinion on anything in the world, but we would never, the British state would never comment on what's going on social and cultural issues in any official capacity. So Roe versus Wade, the rights of women and their own bodies, there would be no statement from the Prime Minister or any official on that. So
there has been a bit of a vibe change in the White House recently, hasn't there? And maybe they're doing things a little differently. Yes, yeah.
No, but the question is, why are they doing that? Why do they feel necessary to comment on it? And I think there are some elements of the US government that would like to paint the UK in a way that isn't really reflective of who we are and what we do. I think the assisted dying bill, although I'm against it, I think the way that parliamentarians on the whole and campaigners on the whole conducted themselves was a real testament to good discourse and discussion in this country. And I think we can be proud of ourselves about the way that we had the conversation, even though I disagree with the outcome. Caroline and I disagree on our positions on this, but we did it respectfully. And so I don't think it's a true reflection of who we are as a country. It is something that they would like us to be for, I don't know, maybe perhaps they'll feel superior.
Starmer's right. It's none of their business, but it seems to me maybe there's they're sending out a bit of a message now. I mean, Canada's got legislation in this area as well.
Had it for years.
And had it for years. Obviously, we're, their most important ally. And we have made a decision, although there's a way to go because it's going through the House of Lords. I think it seems to be maybe also sending out a message to anyone who's thinking in the United States has started a campaign to have something like this legislation there. Don't.
Right. Well, there are some states where it's lawful. It's on a state level, Oregon and various other places. It's also a terrible story about Esther Rantzen and her daughter and deep fakes. And then they wake up one morning and they see that. And again, talking about legislation and what Parliament can do to stop that sort of thing. Imagine the emotional violence when you wake up and you have to confront that, and it's a lie.
I think we've actually got some of the images, haven't we? We must stress that these images about show you are absolutely fake. The lady pictured is not Dame Esther Rantzen, and it's been generated using artificial intelligence to suggest that she's either passed away or is on her deathbed. I mean, devastating for the family to see, devastating for Esther Rantzen to be aware of, and you just wonder at the mentality of people doing that, don't you?
Well, there's obviously the impact on them personally, which is really appalling. I mean, why somebody would generate that to upset people, even if they think it's a legitimate position, doing that is really abhorrent. But there's a second aspect to this, which is how do you regulate deep fake and generative AI? And that is a really pertinent question
it's interesting, but people do believe them. The other day, my mum was about to go and do a talk. Said, I hear you're not very well. What are you talking about? There was some deep fake where apparently Rylan was standing over my hospital bed and I had a bad back or something, having an operation. And but the number of calls that I received because of that sort of thing, and it goes on all of the time.
Awful.
And then, of course, it never, ever gets removed.